Right, afternoon everyone. Yeah, I don't know if anybody caught the Teams message earlier on. I think it's a problem that's rectified itself, but I had a lot of issues in the past hour getting onto the VLE. It seems to have sorted itself out, so I'm not going to dwell on it anymore. I'm going to do things a little bit different this afternoon. I've two areas that I've got to cover. One relates to the lecture, which I'm going to do a little bit differently. It relates to the use of lists in functional programming. So I'm just going to carry on with that as normal, and then I'm going to have a chat to you about the final part of the project in relation to writing up the evaluation side of things. I'm also going to give you details about the end of section test that I've released onto the VLE and just give you an idea of how that's going to work this afternoon. It's that little sort of experiment that I'm planning to go through with regard to using this online testing engine that's built into the VLE. But we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes anyway. This sort of lecture part is... Oh, no, before I start, actually, I've had a question. Let's deal with a question first. Josh has asked, he's made a video going over your project for that like structure design and testing, but it's over a gig, so I can't send it through email or Teams. The best way to deal with large files like that is if you put it onto your Microsoft OneDrive and then share that file with me, and then I just have access to it. I've got sort of plenty of storage I can deal with through college, and then what I'll do is I'll keep it all centrally. It's something that we're going to have to talk about a bit. Well, no, that's something I'll have to talk about quite quickly, to be honest. But we're going to talk about it this week in relation to providing what I would call the evidence of competence. In that, you will obviously need to show evidence of there's your documentation part, but then you've got the evidence of testing. Some of you might be doing that by video, and then you've got the evidence of the final development, which I'm guessing, Josh, is something that you've had a go at, which is sort of like showing your testing and doing some other bits and bobs, which is fine. But one of the issues that we're going to have is being able to demonstrate it. Now, if you've done a video recording of it, that's fine. But I was going to have a think about doing it as a screen share in Teams. I'll talk about it later on. I want to get on with the lecture, but it's something else that we're going to have a chat about at some point. Obviously, you've got homeworks that need to be done and set off, so I'm going to let you obviously get those uploaded to Teams and get those sorted. As far as I'm aware with you lot, everything I've had sent, I have marked and sent back. Therefore, your grades on Pro Monitor are completely up to date. So if you need to, if you need that to be checked, or if you need to check where you're up to, or if there's any gaps or any research you need to do, you need to get on Pro Monitor and get that checked as well. So yeah, all I want to do really is let's get the final part of the lecture done in relation to listing functional programming. Then I'm going to talk about the project evaluations, and then we'll talk about the test engine and things like that we need to have a go at. So what I've done is in REPL, I've created two lists. Remember lists from the last lecture? They're basically like a collection of elements of a similar type. So you could, if you sort of look at them sideways and squint a little bit, they look a bit like arrays, and technically they sort of are. But one thing that you will need to be aware of in Haskell is they're done a little bit differently, in that they actually use two terms that we've already used with queues, namely a head and a tail. But the head of a list in Haskell is the first one, but the tail is actually the rest of the list. So let me sort of try and sort of demo that. I've created two lists here. We can actually output them. That's a good start. Hello. Because I should just be able to display them, and that doesn't even do anything. Let's have a look with numbers. Oh, okay. Let's create them again. That's better. Oh, don't know what happened there. So we've got two lists, one called names, one called numbers, and we can just type in the name of the list and it just outputs the values. Okay, now what I can do is use some more keywords. So for example, if I say head names, we get the first item. But if I use tail names, it actually treats the rest of the list as the tail. Now, that's not to be confused with what you've done in, for example, queues when we did data structures, where the head would have been Anna and the tail would have been George. Everything after the head of the list is treated as the tail. So just something to bear in mind. Now the thing is that obviously because we're dealing with functions, we can apply a list argument repeatedly. So for example, I could say something like that finished that one, that finishes that one, I think that finishes that one. So the tail of numbers is basically from 7 through to 77. The tail of numbers is everything from 14 through 77. And the tail of the tail is everything from 83 through 77. Okay, so we end up with the tail of the tail being everything that's left over from it. Weird, but true. So we can also create empty lists. So I could say something like let new list equals an empty list, and I could attempt to output it, and it gives me an empty list. But there's an extra keyword that we can use, which is null, and null will give us a true or false test to see if that list is actually empty or not. So if I say null names, it will return false because names has actually got things in it, as I would if I said null numbers, because that's got values in it. But if I said num new list, typing it in right, that would return true because it's naturally empty. Now that we've got lists, we can perform two actions on them. Now, in some of the stuff that we did in data structures, we could sort of, if we're talking about queues, we could take off one end, add to the other end, and things like that. And we can sort of do that with the list that we've got in Haskell. The two types of actions that you can perform are what we call prepending and appending. A prepend is add an element to the front of a list. Appending is adding an element to the end of a list. Now, to add an element to the front of a list, we can use something called the colon operator. So if I let you have a look at numbers, so that's the current state of numbers, and I want to prepend a value onto the front of it. So I could say something like 5 numbers, and it will prepend that value onto the front of the list, which is fine. I could add an element, or I could add another list onto the beginning of. So I could prepend a list to my list. So I could say something like 610 and prepend it onto numbers, which works as well. Now, I don't know whether anybody's noticed anything, but the value that I prepended has disappeared, weirdly. But if I put in length numbers, it still tells me 6. That's because the length of the original numbers list, which is set up here, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. which is the original length. Now that sort of hankers back to the original discussion that we started in functional programming, whereby variables are immutable. In which case, what we've actually got, where we've prepended a list onto an existing list, is technically two lists joined together. The original list is immutable. We can't change it. But what we can do is we can add new values onto it, but it's almost like a list that's being prepended onto another list. So you could sort of imagine the real version of this. I don't know whether this is going to work. Allow me to copy and paste. A real version of a list would actually look like that. It's actually not what we expect it to be, which is a full version of a list. So just something that you just need to bear in mind, especially when you're dealing with lists in Haskell. So let's get numbers back again, and let's try the append element. Now we can still use the plus plus elements to append onto the end of a list, but we just put the plus plus on the other side of it. So we could say numbers, which is the original name of the list, and then append 100 to it, which will add 100 onto it. But still, if we find the length, it will remain as 6. So effectively what we've got is this situation again. We're appending onto a list, but the list actually looks like that. We're not in a position where we've actually made any alterations to the original list because it's immutable. We can't change it, and we've proven that by using the length command in order to do that. So would you believe it, that is effectively it. That's everything that we have to cover in terms of manipulation of lists. So what it means is there is an end of section test which I have set up, and I'm just going to try and drag it across from the VLE actually before I do anything else. I have had a lot of problems with the VLE of recent. I'm going to try and resolve that. So this is an experiment which I'm just going to perform with the Leigh cohort, so it's just you lot, and I've placed it into the VLE entry for fundamentals of OOP and functional programming, and it's right at the end, and it's a link to an online test called OOP and functional programming end section test. It's a test which you have an hour to complete, and I think there's either 3 or 4 questions, can't remember it. So if you attempt to click on it now, you're only allowed 1 attempt. It will be available from 3:30 this afternoon, and it will close at 4:30. I've spoken to Mavesh. She's perfectly happy about the test taking place during a normal tutorial time. The only thing I will mention is that the test in itself, one of the questions requires you to draw a diagram and upload it. So you can use whatever tools you see fit to draw a basic diagram. Every question has an input box in order to type an answer in as well. So there's plenty of time if you wanted to work it out on paper and then type it into the box. And with the diagram, I'm perfectly happy for you to draw it on paper and take a picture of it, or use your favourite drawing program to draw the picture that's required, and there's a little drag and drop box that you can upload a file to in order to answer that particular question. That's why I've sort of given you quite a long time to do it. I know usually with a written testing class you get about 45 minutes. Obviously I'm partially experimenting and partially giving you the opportunity to do a test in a different way. Hence the reason why I'm giving you that little bit of extra time. You're only allowed one attempt, and obviously it will lock out by 4:30. So it's in your interest to jump on that as soon as you possibly can. That will only switch on at 3:30. Alright, so you can have a go at that this afternoon. Depending on how it goes, obviously I'll get the answers and I can mark them in the normal way. But that will have a bearing on whether we apply it to other end of section tests. And obviously I want to run a mock exam for paper 2, which is the theoretical element, either second week of the Easter rolls or the first week back after Easter. So I want to see how this goes before I make a decision on what it is I'm going to do. Has anybody got any questions before I move on? Right, okay. So on the VLE in the main bit, have another go. In the section on lists in functional programming, you've got the student worksheet. I think there's about 3 or 4 questions on there. They're not too onerous. And there's the homework sheet, and the homework set on a Monday, in on a Wednesday, please. So that's just normal, bog standard rules that we established for that. So that's sort of like the end of a section. We'll see how that goes. What I want to cover next is in relation to the project. Okay. This is the section out of the student handbook in relation to the project, which is the final part. It's the final section. So you should be in a position where you're getting quite close to the end of the practical element of the project, and as such, you've probably done some testing, or Josh has said he's got some testing already videoed and things like that. Finishing off documentation. Obviously you've got 3 weeks in order to get everything sort of finished off in that respect. There's one final section that you need to do, which is the evaluation. It's split into about 3 subsections, but there are some very specific elements that need to be covered. For me, the most important one is the very beginning one, which is the analysis against your objectives. If you go right back to the beginning of the project, in the analysis phase, you had to define a set of clear objectives, which basically were like the rules that your project was built on. So you have a number of objectives that you defined. My project will do this, the project must do that, this project must do something else. And what you do is you evaluate the overall success of the project against those objectives. So it's literally a case of copying your objectives from your analysis, putting them into a table a bit like this one, and then addressing the success or degree of success by which you've actually met that objective. Now I've put some examples from another project in this one. They don't have anything relating to anybody else's project, but you basically define the objective, give an opinion on whether it's been met or not. Now you can say straight yes or no. You can also address an objective as partially met, in that yes, my system does this and this, but it doesn't do this. And then what you're expected to do is define a comment on that. So if it's met, it's quite a straightforward one. When you do this in this part of the project, the user can do this, they can fill this form in, it performs this calculation or whatever, and therefore the objective is met. If you want to, you can put references in there to testing. So if you've done some testing, you can also use that to back up your successful achievement of an objective as well. So in most cases where objectives have been met, a tabular approach like this is generally straightforward to do, because you just list all your objectives, list them all as either met, list the ones that are met, and have a very brief couple of sentence discussion talking about how it's been met, and reference any evidence to prove so. And hopefully, in the majority of cases, that will be the case. Obviously, it would be nice if all your objectives were met, but if you fail to meet an objective, now the hope is that you don't fail to meet any of your objectives, because by doing that you don't achieve what the project is set out to achieve, which is technically classed as a failure to achieve any objectives. Therefore, the product you produce won't meet the requirements of the end user. But you don't necessarily set yourself up for a project failure if you fail to meet the odd objective. It's like a test. If you fail a test, then in this section you can explain why you failed to meet it. I've got another example I've trimmed off from another project from a couple of years ago, whereby one of the objectives was to be able to redraw a diagram based on a particular situation. It wasn't met, and they've basically said it was very hard to do. I'm not keen on the whole running out of time thing, because it sort of implies bad project management rather than anything else. But if it was hard to program, you could explain what would have been involved that you didn't manage to do in that particular time, rather than just say it was too hard and I didn't have the time to do it. It comes across as a bit weak to an external examiner. But what you could do is you could discuss it in terms of it being a particularly good idea for a possible project extension, i.e. I certainly didn't have the capability to do it at this point in time, but I sort of have an idea as to how it could be done, and I might do a bit more on it as an extension for a future development of the project, rather than a very sort of dismissive approach, which is sort of I didn't have the time and technically it was hard, so I just sort of gave up, which doesn't come across very well if you're sort of reading it from a marking perspective. So your objective analysis is important because it's a measure of the success of the overall project. The next part has a bit of a backstory to it. At one time, the A-level projects required you to develop user documentation, and in short terms, it basically meant you wrote a manual for your project. It was thrown out by the exam board very quickly. The argument was nobody reads the manual anyway, but it was just a formal way of writing up what you'd already done. So it was almost like you were duplicating a task again in a sort of book format. So for the A-level projects now, they ask you to produce some form of client and user feedback mechanism. Now, what that means is that you need to gain some feedback from your live users, or from some live users. Some of you are producing a project for a client, a real client, and it would be an expectation. It would sort of be an expectation that what you can do is put that project in front of a number of people, and they use it, and you give them the ability to give you some feedback on it. There are a couple of sort of websites that are flying around which can be used. I'm just trying to open up a sort of web window at this point, just bear in mind. So for example, there you go. A couple of sites that I've used. Google Forms is quite good. It's cheap and cheerful. Lets you build basic surveys. And then you can build the survey and email it to some people. let them have a look at your project, give them the URL for the form, let them give you some opinions on it about potential improvements, what went well, what didn't go well, and then basically you can collate that information at the end. The other one that I've used before is one called SurveyMonkey. Does a similar thing. Again, there's a free account that you can sign up to. When it finishes loading up. And again, you can sign up for free, generate a basic questionnaire, send them the URL of it, get them to look at your project, and then they can sort of give some opinion on it. Now from that, what can happen is that you can collate some opinions based on what was said. Now you would tend to build these things up from a series of open and closed questions. So, for example, you would say, is it easy to use? Did the system meet your objectives? You would ask the client that because they know what your objectives are. Is there anything that you would like to criticise? Is there anything that's done well? Anything you would like to improve on? Have you got any recommendations for improvements? Which are very open questions, which mean that people can give more written and formulated answers, as opposed to using sort of like tick box type questions, yes, no, or on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being brill, 10 being rubbish. What do you think of it? These two systems, namely Google Forms and SurveyMonkey, does some form of statistical analysis as well, which basically means that you have the ability to extract graphs and charts of feedback as well, and you can use those as part of your client feedback. And the thing is that data is quite valuable in the form of evidence of the evaluation process taking place. What that means is that once you've gone through an evaluative process, you can then perform an analysis of that, and obviously you can welcome any positive comments, any comments or criticisms that you get. You turn those into opportunities for further development or issue correction. You sort of document it in the same way as a failed test. You identify, maybe something went wrong, but you can talk about possible solutions. And again, that's sort of something that you can then move on to the next section, which is possible development opportunities, which is the very last bit. So if you do get any comments or feedback that are suggestions for improvement, you document those in that section. So there can be comments or improvements that have come from your own testing, any comments or improvements from maybe a client looking at it, maybe some comments that have come back from general end user testing saying what could be improved. And for any idea that gets received from that feedback, you can identify, as it says there, what's the nature of the improvement, how would it improve the user's experience, and some vague technical idea on its development and integration. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to build it, but at least it gives the marker some intelligence on your ability to approach the problem in the future, which is what you're expected to sort of come across with at this point, rather than you say, I didn't get the time to do it, but here's the code that I would have written. We don't want that level of detail at this point. We want the ability for someone to say, I accept that these are issues, this is how I would approach them, and this is a potential development idea for future incarnations of the same project. And that realistically then completes the end of the project. Now, I've had some bits of comments in that. I've recovered my code from the VLE and literally none of it works. I don't know what you mean by the VLE, so I don't know where you've been storing on the VLE. you might have to give me a bit more background on that. VLE Cloud. Right, so that's your W drive then. That to me looks like not everything's being extracted. Very difficult to sort of make a judgment, obviously, because I can't see what's going on, but I'm just wondering whether you're actually extracting everything, because it's saying it can't find the project file. Well, that's your SLN file, which to me sounds like the solution file's not been extracted enough. And if you've only extracted the part of the project, then it could be that that's missing as well. So it could be that wherever you're extracting it from, if you've stored it on your W drive, you need to make sure that the whole lot, I think by default, is down. If you select something to download it, it downloads it as a zip file. Maybe it needs to be checked that you're extracting it, and then you can implement it properly, which is sort of the implication I'm getting at the minute. Bit difficult with sort of the descriptions that you've got, but that's the impression I'm getting based on what I'm seeing at the minute. Might be worth doing a few more checks first and then get back to me. Right. Okay. So that's basically sort of it in terms of everything that's sort of needs to be covered today. The main points that obviously that need to be sort of thought about and covered. In the first instance, it's not my email. In the first instance, it's the classwork for this particular section. All right, the student worksheet with the bits of the bits of questions, and then obviously the homework, which is due on Wednesday. And obviously I'm expecting some homeworks today. I tend to be able to get those marked very, very quickly. So yeah, they need extracting and sorting out. The test is open from 3:30 this afternoon, so expect everybody to have a go at that. And obviously the project is an ongoing thing, and obviously we'll make some we need to make some decisions about how we're going to present those projects after the half term, because obviously that's due at I'm just trying to get this idea of dates. So it's due on the 16th of April. Just checking my calendar. I have had a chat with the other group at Wigan, namely Marcus, and the idea basically is that we I can't sit next to you while you demonstrate the product. So the expectation will probably be that you will be able to screencast a possible solution, in that maybe we can do it as a Teams call, whereby you do a screen share and then demonstrate your project in that respect. It's something that will, failing that, we could, we could do a sort of some kind of a screencast if you don't want to do it over Teams, but you'll just have to record yourself demonstrating it. I think, Josh, you've used OBS, and like I say, I know the file sizes will be big, but I think OneDrive will give us a perfect opportunity to share very large video files, in which case we'll just carry on. We'll just carry on like that if it seems to work. And in that respect, yeah, there's plenty to be going on with now. We've got the class worksheets. You've got about 25 minutes now. Have a go at the class worksheets and basically have a go at those. Let me have those as soon as possible. You've got the test at 3:30, which Mavesh has kindly allowed us to do in the tutorial session. And the homework is due on Wednesday. That's for lists in functional programming, which is on the VLE now. don't forget as well, there's some homework due for me as well from the last lecture, which is the forgot the name of the section, which is due about, let me just look, function application. Okay, in which case, like I say, that's sort of due now. Right, so I shall leave it at that. Josh, my OneDrive crashed downloading it. I'll try again, but can't promise anything. I'm assuming this is attempting to try and download your project. I have had issues with OneDrive in the past dealing with very large files, and that's like groups of students' files, like 18, 19 groups of folders. It depends how you're accessing it. It might be better if you're using OneDrive. Don't use the web interface. If you're working at home, I'm assuming you are, I want you to install the OneDrive application, which seems to work a bit more robustly. It interfaces with Windows operating system a lot better, and it doesn't use sort of HTTP and sort of like web-based protocols. So if you're finding that you're having trouble with it, set up the OneDrive application, and it seems to be a bit more robust. I use that virtually all the time now. The only time I can't use it is when I'm sharing stuff and I have to use the web interface, but I'll do all the prep work in the app, and if you put your college details in, it'll interface with that almost straight away. Jack, the only thing I can suggest is, obviously you've a zip file, you've extracted it. I don't know, maybe send me a copy of it. I'll have a look at it, and I'll just see where I can go from there. Okay, I'll leave this open for a couple of minutes if you want to ask any other questions. Apart from that, then obviously you've got the classwork script to have a look at, the homework script for Wednesday, the test which starts at 3:30 for 1 hour, and obviously hopefully your project is ongoing in that respect. Okay, but I'll sort of finish the sort of lecture at this point. I'll keep the stream open for a few more minutes in case anybody's got any questions. Yeah, hopefully everything goes on all right with the test this afternoon. I'd like to see that used a bit more for testing purposes, but we'll see how it goes, and then we'll see what happens.